My mom never believed in me, but when I won $150,000, she demanded the money, sued me, and after I won, her boyfriend attacked me. I'm not really sure where to begin. This story has been bottled up inside me for years, and I think it's time I finally let it out. After reading so many posts on here, I realize I'm probably not as alone as I used to think. Maybe some of you know what it's like to grow up in a house where the word love gets tossed around, but it doesn't actually mean a thing. So this is my story. I'm not looking for advice or anything. I just hope maybe someone out there can relate. For as long as I can remember, my parents made it clear I wasn't wanted. My mom, Kelly, was the queen of backhanded compliments and lies. My dad, Greg, didn't need to say much. His silence was punishment enough. But when he did speak, his words hit like bullets. He was never there when I needed him, and when he was around, I wished he wasn't. Growing up in that house felt like living in a pressure cooker. It wasn't just the screaming matches or the passive-aggressive digs. It was the constant feeling of walking on eggshells. Every single day felt like another chance to screw up and trigger their disappointment, anger, or outright disgust. And for some reason, I was always the target. My older sister, Rebecca, was the golden child. No matter what she did, she was praised. I'll never forget one time when I was about 8 years old. I accidentally broke a vase while playing in the living room. Rebecca had dared me to throw a ball inside the house, which we obviously weren't allowed to do. When the vase shattered, she immediately burst into tears, acting like she had nothing to do with it. Mom came storming in, and before I could even explain, she was yelling, "Why can't you be more like Rebecca? She never causes trouble. You're always screwing things up, aren't you?" The best part? Rebecca got ice cream that night while I got sent to bed without dinner. That was pretty much how things went in our house. Rebecca got away with everything, and I was the punching bag. School was the only place I ever felt even remotely human. The teachers didn't scream at me, and while the other kids weren't exactly my friends, at least they didn't treat me like trash. But even school wasn't a safe place for long. Middle school is when the bullying started. And it wasn't just the typical name-calling or teasing. It was like the other kids could sense how broken I was. Like they knew I didn't have anyone in my corner. I was tall for my age, lanky, awkward, so I became an easy target. They called me names like giraffe and freak and shoved me in the hallways. One time, a group of kids even locked me in the janitor's closet for hours during lunch. I pounded on the door until my knuckles were raw, but no one ever came. When I told my parents about it, my dad just said, "Man up, kid. Life's hard." And that was it, conversation over. After that, I stopped trying at school. My grades went downhill fast, and by the time I hit high school, I was barely hanging on. At that point, I didn't even care anymore. Why bother? It didn't matter what I did at home or school. I was always a failure. Honestly, I don't know how I even made it through high school, but somehow I did. Though, there was one moment that really broke me. It was junior year when I somehow clawed my way onto the track team. Running was the only thing that made me feel alive. Every time my feet hit the ground, it was like I could outrun all the pain and chaos at home, even if just for a while. I wasn't the fastest, not even close, but I was decent. And for the first time in years, I actually had something to look forward to. We had a big meet coming up, and I felt a flicker of real excitement, something I hadn't felt in ages. I told my mom about it, practically begging her to come watch. She barely looked up from her phone, muttering, "We'll see," but of course they didn't come. Not to that meet, not to any meet, not even once. It shouldn't have shocked me, I mean, why would they? But it still tore me apart. What really killed me was seeing all the other kids with their parents, cheering them on, hugging them afterward. Mine? They couldn't even be bothered to pretend they cared. But the worst part was still to come. One day, after a meet, I overheard my mom on the phone with one of her friends. She didn't know I was standing just around the corner. "Oh, he's such a loser," she laughed. "I don't know what to do with him anymore. He's never going to amount to anything." Her words cut deeper than anything I'd ever felt. She wasn't just annoyed or disappointed in me. She straight up hated me. And that's when something inside me snapped. From that moment on, I started hating myself too. Somehow, I scraped together just enough to get into a local university. Not because I was smart or motivated, but because I needed to get out of that house, even if it was just for a few hours a day. I wasn't aiming for a degree or some bright future. I just needed to escape. But college wasn't the fresh start I'd hoped for. I didn't fit in, at all. Everyone else seemed like they had it all together, while I was barely holding myself together with frayed threads. I tried making friends, but it was like I didn't know how. How could I connect with anyone when I didn't even know how to be a normal human being? During finals week, everything came crashing down. I hadn't slept in days, running on empty, and then it hit me. A full-on breakdown. I locked myself in my dorm room and cried until I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was drowning in failure, and the thought of dropping out or worse crept into my mind. I seriously considered ending it all. What was the point of dragging myself through life if I was just going to keep failing, keep disappointing everyone, including myself? But somehow I didn't. Something held me back, though I'm not even sure what. Maybe it was fear, maybe a tiny, desperate hope that things could still change. Whatever it was, I forced myself to push through, even though every part of me wanted to give up. After graduation, things only got worse. I found myself stuck back in that hellish house. No job, no money, no future. My parents were relentless. "Why are you still here?" my dad would sneer. "You're an adult now. Act like it." But they didn't understand. They couldn't. It wasn't as simple as just fixing my life. I was broken, completely shattered, and they never even cared to notice. Every time I applied for a job, I was rejected. Every time I tried to save money, something would come up and drain whatever little I had. I felt completely trapped. And then it happened. One night, during yet another screaming match with my mom, she said something I'll never forget. "I wish you had never been born," she screamed. "You've ruined everything." It was like a switch flipped in my brain. In that moment, I realized something I had been avoiding my whole life. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough for them. They were never going to love me the way parents are supposed to love their children. That night, I packed my bags and left. I didn't have a plan, just a suitcase and whatever cash I'd managed to scrape together. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house another second. I moved to a new city, far away from my parents, and found a job. Nothing glamorous, just enough to get by. But for the first time in my life, I felt free. No one was breathing down my neck, constantly reminding me I was worthless. No more walking on eggshells. It wasn't easy, though. I had to learn how to live on my own, how to function like a normal person. There were nights where the loneliness hit so hard that I started to wonder if I'd made the right decision. But every time the thought of going back crossed my mind, I remembered what my mom had said, and I remembered all the years of emotional abuse, the neglect, and the manipulation. I knew I could never return to that life. I'm still figuring things out. I'm still struggling, still trying to put together all the broken pieces of myself. But at least now I'm doing it on my own terms. I'm far from perfect, but I'm free. After leaving that toxic environment, I felt like I could finally breathe. I didn't have much, just a few $100 and the sheer determination to make something of myself, but I was no longer trapped in that nightmare. I found a job pretty quickly, though it wasn't what I had imagined. I ended up at a call center doing customer service for a tech company. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it was enough to scrape by. I rented a tiny, dingy apartment and lived off instant ramen, but I didn't care. It was still better than being at home. First, the job was brutal. I had no experience, and dealing with angry customers every day was exhausting. People would scream at me for things I couldn't control, and some days I'd leave work feeling like I was right back where I started, stuck in a never-ending cycle of being blamed for things that weren't my fault. But this time, there was no running away. I had to stick it out. The thing is, after everything I've been through, I've learned that I'm nothing if not resilient. Growing up in a house where I was constantly under attack, emotionally beaten down, it hardened me. Over time, I built up thick skin, and little by little, I started to excel. I learned how to diffuse angry customers, solve problems on the fly, and most importantly, stay calm no matter how much venom people spat at me. It wasn't an instant transformation, but after 6 grueling months, I rose to the top of the team. The call center wasn't where I wanted to be forever, but it became my launchpad. My manager, Chris, started noticing the difference. He gave me tougher cases, put me in charge of training new hires, and I was the go-to guy for overtime when everyone else bailed. Suddenly, I wasn't just scraping by, I was standing out. Then one day, Chris called me into his office. My heart was pounding, thinking I'd messed up or that something was wrong. But instead, he hit me with a curveball. "You've been killing it. Gee, we want you to be a team lead." Couldn't believe it. It wasn't a huge pay bump, but it was the first real acknowledgement I'd ever gotten. I'd be overseeing a small team, making sure things ran smoothly, and training others, something I never thought I'd be trusted with. I accepted the promotion on the spot, and from that point on, everything changed. Within a year, I went from team lead to supervisor, and soon after, I was running entire projects. I was overseeing multiple teams across different departments. I could barely wrap my head around it, how far I'd come. My paychecks were finally getting bigger, and for the first time in my life, I had something I never thought I'd feel: stability. I started saving like crazy, diving deep into the tech side of the business, and using every waking moment to improve my skills. But managing people? That was just the beginning. I quickly realized that managing entire projects, budgets, and operations was a whole new battlefield. It was overwhelming, but I was determined not just to survive but to dominate. I took every online course I could find, devoured business books, and stayed late, absorbing everything like a sponge. If I wanted to keep climbing, I knew I had to be unbeatable. I wasn't content just being good, I had to be the best. It became an obsession. I threw myself into learning everything: productivity hacks, process improvements, data analytics, even coding. I wanted to be the one person the company couldn't afford to lose. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get better, they did. The company offered me a position as an operations manager, overseeing call centers across the country. My salary skyrocketed, and for the first time in my life I felt secure. I'd spent so many years scraping by that when the money started rolling in, I didn't even know how to process it. I was still living in that rundown apartment, driving my beat-up car and eating cheap food. But after everything I'd been through, I realized I deserved something better. So I made my first real splurge. I bought myself a car. Not just any car, but a sleek, brand new beauty that made me feel like I'd finally arrived. For the first time, I felt like I had one. I bought a luxury sports car. It cost $150,000, more money than I ever thought I'd spend on anything. But I didn't care. I wanted something that screamed how far I had come, something that reminded me, every time I saw it, that I had made it. Walking into the dealership, I half expected them to laugh me out the door. But when I drove off in that sleek machine, I felt unstoppable. The engine's roar was pure power, and the leather seats hugged me like a throne. For the first time, I felt like I truly had control over my life. I had arrived. It was around this time I met someone, Natalie. She seemed perfect at first. We met through mutual friends at a party, and right from the start, I thought I had found what I'd been missing. Natalie was everything I thought I wanted: smart, funny, ambitious. She worked in marketing for a big downtown firm, and from the moment we started talking, it felt like we clicked. We went on a few dates, and before long, most of our weekends were spent together. Natalie had this charm, a confidence that drew me in, and she seemed genuinely interested in me. Really interested. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd found someone who saw me for who I was, who didn't try to change me or make me feel small. But things started to get complicated. First, it was little things. Natalie always seemed busy with work, and it got harder and harder to find time to see each other. She'd cancel plans at the last minute or show up late, always with some excuse. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured she was just stressed, like I was with my job. But then I noticed other things. She started pulling away, becoming emotionally distant. She'd be there with me physically, but it was like she was somewhere else entirely. We'd go out to dinner, and she'd spend the entire time on her phone, scrolling through work emails. Or we'd make plans for the weekend, and she'd flake on me, without so much as a text explaining why. One night, I'd had enough. We were supposed to go out and celebrate my latest promotion, something I had worked so hard for. But she canceled at the last minute. Again. That was it. I couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. Natalie, what's going on? I asked, my frustration boiling over. You've been pulling away for weeks now, and I don't understand why. If you don't want to be in this relationship anymore, just say it. She looked at me like I just blindsided her. Like she didn't even realize how distant she'd become. I'm sorry, G. It's just, work has been insane lately. I didn't mean to make you feel like I don't care. I really do. I'm just under so much pressure right now. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that everything would go back to the way it was once her workload eased up. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. There was this nagging feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. But I ignored it. I didn't want to lose her. I didn't want to go back to being alone. But things didn't get better. Natalie kept pulling away, and I kept chasing after her, desperately trying to hold on to what we had. I was clinging to the idea of us, convincing myself that if I just tried harder, she'd come back to me. But the more I chased, the more she slipped away. It was like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. I tried everything. I surprised her with flowers, planned elaborate dates, did anything I could think of just to get her attention. But it was like she was slipping through my fingers, and no matter what I did, I couldn't stop it. Then one day, everything came crashing down. I was at work, scrolling through emails, when I got a message from a coworker. Hey, isn't this your girlfriend? There was a link attached. I clicked on it and my heart dropped. It was a photo of Natalie at a bar with some guy I didn't recognize. They were sitting close, laughing, her hand resting on his arm. It wasn't anything blatantly incriminating, but it felt like someone had punched me straight in the gut. I had no idea who this guy was, and she had never mentioned going out that night. Panic surged through me. I called her immediately, no answer. I shot off a text, nothing. The rest of the day I couldn't think straight. My mind was spiraling, racing through a million questions. Who was this guy? Why didn't she tell me she was going out? Is this why she's been pulling away? When I finally got home that night, I found her sitting in my apartment, waiting for me. The look on her face told me everything. I didn't even need to ask. She looked guilty, like she already knew what I had seen. I'm sorry, G, she said, her voice soft and full of regret, cutting through the silence before I could even get a word out. I was going to tell you. I didn't know how. Tell me what? I asked, my voice trembling. There's someone else, she said, barely meeting my eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I don't know. We just connected. I've been trying to figure out what to do, but I didn't want to hurt you. Felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My entire world spun in that moment. Every late night, every canceled plan, every excuse. Everything suddenly made sense. She had been seeing someone else behind my back this whole time. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, numb, my mind blank as the reality of it settled in. I wanted to scream, to shout, to tear into her for betraying me, for making me feel like a fool. But the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was how blind I'd been, how stupid I felt for not seeing it sooner. I'm sorry, she whispered again, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. That night, she left, and I didn't stop her. I didn't fight for the relationship because, in that moment, I realized it wasn't worth fighting for. She had already made her choice, and I wasn't going to beg her to stay. Not anymore. In the days that followed, I buried myself in work. I stayed late, took on extra projects, anything to drown out the hurt that gnawed at me from the inside. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the pain didn't just disappear. It clung to me like a shadow. I felt like I had failed, again. I wasn't good enough. Just like my parents always said, I was always going to end up alone, always going to be left behind. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. The pain didn't feel as sharp anymore. And slowly, I realized something. Natalie's betrayal wasn't about me. It wasn't a reflection of who I was or how much I was worth. It was her choice, her mistake. For the first time in my life, I stopped blaming myself for someone else's actions. Now I'm still here, working hard, rebuilding myself piece by piece. I don't know what comes next, but I'm determined to keep moving forward. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible. And no one, not my parents, not Natalie, can take that away from me. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that I'm stronger than I ever thought I was. I hadn't seen my parents since the day I left home all those years ago. After everything they put me through, the emotional abuse, the neglect, I had no intention of ever seeing them again. I cut off all contact, deleted their numbers, and moved to a different city, determined to build a life without them. And I did. My career was on an upward trajectory, and despite the heartbreak with Natalie, I was doing well. Life had finally started to fall into place. Then they showed up, like ghosts from the past, determined to tear everything apart. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was lounging at home, finally unwinding after a brutal week of work. I'd been putting in long hours preparing for a major project launch at the company, so I hadn't had much time to relax. I was planning to take the car out later, maybe drive down the coast to clear my head. The car, the one I bought for $150,000. My pride and joy sat gleaming in the driveway, a symbol of everything I had worked so hard to achieve. That's when I heard the knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I figured it was just a delivery or maybe a neighbor. But when I opened the door, it felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Standing there in the flesh were my parents, Kelly and Greg. After all these years, they hadn't changed much. My mom still had that icy, judgmental look in her eyes, the same one that had cut me down as a kid. And my dad, he still carried that silent, looming presence, the kind that made you feel small just by standing near him. For a moment, I froze, my mind racing. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I could think was, why are they here? Why now? Gee, my mom said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she always used when she wanted something. It's been so long. I didn't invite them in. I just stood there, staring at them, wondering why the hell they were on my doorstep after all these years. What do you want? I finally managed to ask, keeping my voice as calm as possible, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. We need to talk, my dad said, stepping forward just enough to make his presence known. His eyes drifted past me, catching sight of the car parked in the driveway. I could feel it, the old dynamic creeping back in, the familiar feeling of being powerless, of being that kid who could never do anything right. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I had worked too hard to let them drag me back into their twisted world. What are you doing here? I asked again, this time with more force. My mom sighed dramatically, like this whole situation was an inconvenience for her. We've fallen on hard times, G, she said, her voice full of feigned helplessness. We've had some financial difficulties, and we could really use your help. She glanced over at the car, her eyes lingering. We saw the car outside, and, well, it's obvious you've been doing pretty well for yourself. We were thinking maybe you could, let us borrow it, just until we get back on our feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents, who had never supported me, who made my life a living hell for years, were now standing on my doorstep asking for a favor. Asking for my car. The one thing that symbolized everything I had overcome, everything I had built for myself despite them. I stood there, stunned, anger boiling just beneath the surface. My heart pounded, and all the years of pain, the memories of feeling worthless, came rushing back. They hadn't changed. They didn't come to apologize or make amends. They came to take. They saw what I had achieved and felt entitled to it, just like they had always taken from me emotionally, draining me of my self-worth. I can't help you, I finally said, my voice cold and firm. My dad stepped closer, his towering frame trying to intimidate me like it always had. Come on, G, he said. His tone still low but now laced with that subtle threat I knew so well. We raised you. The least you can do is help us out. I felt the walls closing in, but then I remembered. I wasn't that scared, broken kid anymore. I'd built a life, my life, and they had no place in it. You raised me? I asked, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. You mean the years of neglect? The years of telling me I'd never be good enough, never amount to anything? You didn't raise me, you broke me, And now, you think you can just waltz back into my life and ask for help? Ask for my car? The answer is no. I owe you nothing. They both stood there, stunned, as if they couldn't believe I had the nerve to stand up to them. My dad's face hardened, but I didn't care anymore. I wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. Get off my property, I said, my voice low and final. Without another word, they turned and left. As they walked away, I felt the weight of years of pain and resentment lift off my shoulders. I watched them go, knowing this time it was for good. They were ghosts of my past, and I wasn't going to let them haunt me anymore. I shut the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. I wasn't the kid they had tried to break. I was stronger, more resilient than they ever gave me credit for. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. My parents, who made my childhood a living hell, were standing on my doorstep, asking for my car. My $150,000 car. The one thing I had bought for myself after years of grinding, working my way out of the wreckage they left me in. I stared at them, disbelief swirling in my mind. I needed to be sure I hadn't misheard. You want my car? I asked, my voice barely masking the anger building inside me. Yes, my mom replied, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. You've always been so selfish, G. We raised you, took care of you, and now, when we need a little help, you act like we're asking for the world. It's just a car. I could feel my blood boiling. This was classic Kelly. Twisting the narrative, making me the bad guy, trying to guilt-trip me into doing what she wanted. But not this time. No, I said, my voice firm. You can't have my car. I'm not giving it to you. For a moment, silence hung between us. Then my dad stepped forward, his face darkening with anger. He leaned in, using that old intimidating stance I remembered all too well. You owe us, G, he said, his voice low and menacing. We're your parents. After everything we did for you, the least you can do is help us out. I couldn't help it. I laughed. I laughed right in their faces, incredulous at the audacity of their demands. Everything you did for me? You mean the emotional abuse? The years of neglect? Making me feel like I was worthless my entire childhood? And you seriously think I owe you anything? My mom's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. We made you who you are. Gee, don't forget that. I felt a surge of strength, something I hadn't felt in years when facing them. I stepped forward, no longer the scared kid they used to bully, but a man who had fought to make a life for himself. No, I said, my voice steely. I made myself who I am. I did this on my own. I don't owe you anything, and I'm not giving you my car. Now, get off my property. Without waiting for a response, I slammed the door in their faces. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought shutting the door on them would finally sever the ties, that they'd realize they couldn't manipulate me anymore. But I underestimated them. I should have known better. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a lawyer. My parents were suing me. They were claiming they had helped me financially in the past, that they had contributed to my success, and that they were entitled to a portion of my assets, specifically the car. The letter went on to detail how, in their twisted logic, they believed they had a right to the car because they had invested in me growing up, and now that I was doing well, they wanted their cut. I was floored. I couldn't believe the audacity. I hadn't taken a single penny from them since the day I walked out of that house. If anything, they had drained me, emotionally and financially, for years, and now they wanted to take me to court? Over a car? It was insane. I immediately contacted a lawyer, a woman named Sarah who came highly recommended by a coworker. When I explained the situation to her, she was as baffled as I was. But she didn't flinch. This is absurd, she said during our first meeting. They have no legal claim to your car or your money. But we're going to have to fight this. And so we did. The lawsuit dragged on for months, longer than I ever could have imagined. I had to attend multiple court hearings, submit endless documents, and deal with the relentless legal back and forth. Every time I thought it couldn't get any worse, my parents upped the ante. They painted me as an ungrateful son, a selfish child who had abandoned his family after they had sacrificed so much for me. Their lawyer, a sleazy guy named Martin, spun a web of lies, trying to make it seem like my parents had played a crucial role in my success, as if without them I'd never have been able to afford the car in the first place. It was all lies, of course, but the way they twisted the narrative was chilling. They were rewriting history, erasing the years of abuse and neglect, pretending that they had been loving, supportive parents all along. Seeing them in court was the worst part. They sat there with smug looks on their faces, as if they were on the verge of winning. They showed no remorse, no shame for what they were putting me through. My dad, as always, barely said a word, letting my mom do all the talking. And she played the role of the concerned, heartbroken mother perfectly, acting like this whole ordeal was about keeping the family together and making sure everyone got what they deserved. But Sarah, my lawyer, wasn't having any of it. She tore their case apart, piece by piece, exposing every lie, every exaggeration. She brought in witnesses, friends from my childhood who testified to the way my parents had treated me. Former teachers took the stand and recounted how withdrawn and unhappy I'd been as a kid. Sarah even managed to get hold of old medical records that documented the stress and anxiety I had endured because of my toxic home life. As the trial wore on, my parents' lies started to unravel. My mom's story shifted multiple times, and the more she tried to manipulate the situation, the worse it got for them. At one point, she even claimed they had given me an inheritance when I left home. An outright lie so absurd that even the judge raised an eyebrow. The turning point came when Sarah brought in a financial expert. He had gone through my earnings and spending history with a fine-tooth comb, and his report was clear. I had never received a single cent from my parents. The car, every dollar I had earned, was all from my hard work. Nothing from them. It became painfully clear to everyone in that courtroom that my parents had no claim to anything I owned. Their entire case had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, just like everything else they had done to me growing up. But that didn't stop them from trying to guilt me one last time. During one of the final hearings, my mom broke down in tears on the stand, sobbing about how difficult it had been for her to watch her only son turn his back on his family. She wept about the sacrifices she had made, how much she had given up for me, how heartbroken she was over everything that had happened. She played the victim, clinging to the same manipulative tactics she'd used on me my whole life. But I wasn't buying it. Not this time. And neither was the judge. As she continued her tearful performance, I could see the judge's patience wearing thin. He had seen the evidence, the testimonies, and all the lies my parents had spun. When it was over, the judge didn't hold back. He ruled in my favor, dismissing my parents' claims entirely. Their case had no merit. It was a desperate attempt to take from me, just as they always had. When the ruling came down, I felt a wave of relief. The fight was over. I had won, not just in court but in a much bigger way. I had finally broken free from their toxic grip. They couldn't control me anymore. They couldn't take from me anymore. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I knew this was the last time they would ever have power over me. I was done being their pawn. I had built my life, my success, and no one, not my parents, not their lies, not their manipulation, could ever take that away from me. In the end, the court ruled in my favor, dismissing my parents' lawsuit as baseless and ordering them to pay my legal fees. I had won. After years of being under their thumb, of feeling powerless, I finally stood up to them and came out on top. I didn't gloat as I walked out of that courtroom, didn't even glance in their direction, but inside, I felt the weight of years of pain lifting. For the first time, I truly felt free. They had tried to tear me down, tried to take everything I had worked for, but I fought back, and I won. After that, I cut them off completely. I blocked their numbers, severed every line of communication, and moved on with my life. I had spent too long being dragged down by their toxicity, and I was never going back. The experience changed me. It made me stronger, more determined to protect what I had built. I learned something crucial. Just because someone is family doesn't mean they have the right to control, abuse, or take from you. I had fought for my freedom, and now that I had it, I wasn't going to let anyone take it away. Months passed, and things were finally falling into place. I was working hard, still driving my car, and continuing to build the life I deserved. The days of chaos were behind me, and for the first time in forever, I was at peace. I had new friends, a solid job, and a sense of purpose. I thought the worst was behind me, but then, something happened that shook me to my core. It wasn't my parents this time. No, it was someone from my father's past. A man I hadn't thought about in years, who came crashing back into my life in the most violent, unexpected way. It was a Friday evening. I had just gotten home from work, ready to finally relax after a long week. I'd ordered takeout, planning to unwind and enjoy a quiet night. My life had started to feel normal again, like I was finally in control. The future seemed bright for once. Then there was a knock at the door. Unlike the day my parents showed up, I wasn't expecting anything except the delivery guy. But when I opened the door, it wasn't him. Standing there was someone I hadn't seen since I was a kid, Tom. My father's old drinking buddy. A man who spent most of his weekends at our house, drinking and spewing whatever nonsense guys like him and my dad thought was worth talking about. Seeing him now, after all these years, sent an ice-cold chill down my spine. Tom hadn't changed much. Same rough, weathered face, the same unsettling look in his eyes, like he was always on the verge of something dangerous. He looked at me like he was sizing me up, and my stomach twisted in knots. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my voice tight. He smirked, that same smug grin I remembered from my childhood. "Long time, no CG," he said, his voice dripping with familiarity that made my skin crawl. "Mind if I come in?" I didn't move. The last time I'd seen Tom, I was a scared kid watching him and my dad drink themselves into oblivion. And now, here he was, standing on my doorstep like he had every right to be there. "No," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "You need to leave." But Tom wasn't backing down. He stepped forward, forcing me to step back, and suddenly, the air felt heavy, charged with tension. My mind raced. Why was he here? What did he want? I could feel the unease creeping up my spine, the memories of him and my father hanging around the house, always with a sinister edge. "Your dad owes me, G," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what my father had gotten into, but I knew it couldn't be good. Tom wasn't the type of man you wanted showing up at your door, especially not with that look in his eyes. "I don't owe you anything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, I was unraveling. "Now get the hell off my property." Tom's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed making people squirm. "Oh, I think you do. Your old man may not be around to pay his debts, but that doesn't mean you're off the hook." I felt my stomach drop. My father had been gone from my life for years, but now his ghosts were coming back to haunt me, and I had no idea how far this was going to go. "You've got the wrong guy," I said, stepping forward, trying to muster the courage to stand my ground. "I'm not my father, and whatever he owed you, it's not my problem." But Tom didn't move. His eyes darkened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to push past me into the house. The tension between us was suffocating, and I could feel the threat hanging in the air like a storm about to break. "I'm not leaving until I get what I'm owed," he said, his voice barely a whisper now, but the menace in it was undeniable. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew one thing. This wasn't over. And whatever my father had done, I was about to be dragged into the middle of it, whether I liked it or not. Tom was a rough guy, big, burly, and always reeking of alcohol. I remembered him from my childhood as loud and intimidating, the kind of presence that filled a room with tension. Even as a kid, I had kept my distance. I hadn't seen him since I left home, but now, there he was, standing on my doorstep with a scowl carved into his face. "Tom," I said, my voice shaky. His unexpected appearance set me on edge immediately. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting, just stared at me with bloodshot eyes. The stench of alcohol hit me before he even spoke. "You don't drink with me anymore, boy." Tom slurred as he took a step forward, swaying. His words dripped with aggression. "What? You think you're better than me now?" I was caught completely off guard. I hadn't spoken to Tom in years. Hell, I'd never even drunk with him. He and my dad used to have their drunken weekends, but I'd always stayed on the sidelines. Now, out of nowhere, he was on my doorstep, accusing me of something that made no sense. I don't know what you're talking about, Tom, I said, trying to keep calm, though my pulse was racing. I haven't seen you in years. You should go. But instead of leaving, Tom shoved the door open, barging into my house like a wrecking ball. I stumbled back, completely unprepared for the sudden burst of aggression. Before I could react, he lunged at me, his fists swinging wildly. Tom was strong, really strong. His punches landed with brutal force, the first one sinking deep into my stomach, knocking the wind out of me. Before I could even catch my breath, he followed up with a hard punch to my face. I hit the floor, dazed, blood dripping from my nose, my vision blurred. All I could see was Tom's furious face looming above me, his fists clenched and ready for more. You think you can just ignore me and your old man? Tom roared, his voice laced with venom. You're nothing, G. You're just like him. Useless. I tried to push myself up, but Tom was relentless. He kicked me hard in the ribs, and I heard a sickening crack. Pain shot through my side like fire, and I gasped for air, struggling to breathe. I could taste blood in my mouth, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of why this was happening. Why this man, a ghost from my father's past, was attacking me in my own home. The attack felt like it lasted forever. Every time I tried to move, to scramble away, Tom would grab me, dragging me back and landing more blows. My world shrank to nothing but pain and fear. Tom's fists, the searing agony in my ribs, and the sound of his voice shouting above me. What saved me were the neighbors. I lived in a quiet area, but thankfully people were always out and about. Some passers-by must have heard the commotion, the sound of Tom's enraged shouts and the thudding of his fists, and rushed over to see what was going on. They saw through the window that I was being attacked and called the police immediately. I didn't know any of this at the time. By then, I was barely conscious, just trying to protect my head, curled up on the floor, praying it would end. I remember hearing muffled voices outside, people shouting for Tom to stop, but the pain and fear were overwhelming. The next thing I knew, a group of neighbors had burst into the house. They didn't hesitate. They pulled Tom off me, forcing him to the ground as he cursed and struggled. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Tom tried to break free, but the neighbors held him down until the police arrived. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was Tom's furious face, twisted with rage, as they dragged him out of my house. The neighbors had burst through my front door, pulling Tom off me and pinning him to the ground. I could hear the sound of sirens in the distance, knowing help was finally on the way, but I was too weak to move, barely able to open my eyes. I lay there, battered and bleeding, feeling detached from my own body. One of the neighbors knelt beside me, trying to talk to me, but their voice was muffled, like I was underwater. Everything felt distant, surreal, like it was happening to someone else. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sound of the police arriving, and Tom being dragged out of my house in handcuffs. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. My entire body ached, my head pounded, and my face felt swollen. I could barely open my eyes, but I could feel the tubes and machines hooked up to me, the heart monitor's steady beeping, the drip in my arm. I wasn't in great shape. A nurse came in a few moments later, checking on me, making sure I was stable. You're lucky to be alive, she said, her voice soft and gentle. You've got some broken ribs, a concussion, and a lot of bruising, but you're going to be okay. Relief washed over me for a brief moment, but it was quickly followed by anger. How had this happened? Why had Tom attacked me? I didn't know him anything. I hadn't even spoken to him in years, and yet here I was, lying in a hospital bed, lucky to be alive. The nurse told me I had been unconscious for a while. The police had taken Tom into custody, and there would be a full investigation. Apparently, he had resisted arrest, even trying to fight the officers when they arrived. It wasn't looking good for him. It didn't take long for Tom to be formally charged with assault and battery. The police had all the evidence they needed. Eyewitnesses, the brutal injuries I'd suffered, and Tom's drunken state when they arrested him. The case was open and shut, and I knew I would have to testify against him when the time came. The weeks after the attack were some of the hardest of my life. I was in and out of the hospital, dealing with the aftermath. My ribs were still sore, each breath a painful reminder of what had happened. The trauma kept me from sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tom's face, felt his fists slamming into me, heard his rage-filled voice calling me worthless. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. I wasn't going to let him get away with what he had done. When the trial came around, I was still healing, but I was determined to stand up and tell my story. In court, Tom tried to play the victim. His lawyer painted him as a man who had been through tough times, who had fallen into a spiral of drinking, and who didn't even remember the attack. They argued he hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that it had been a tragic mistake, that he was simply a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I wasn't having any of it. When I took the stand, I told the court exactly what had happened. I described how Tom had barged into my house, drunk and aggressive. I told them how he had attacked me without warning, how he had beaten me senseless, and how I had feared for my life. The witnesses testified to the chaos they had seen through the window, how they had heard Tom's furious shouts and seen me struggling to survive. The truth was laid bare for everyone to see. Tom wasn't a victim. He was a violent man who had let his anger and alcohol take control. No amount of excuses could cover up what he had done. Tom had spewed nonsense during the attack, ranting about how I didn't drink with him anymore, like I owed him something. I explained to the court that I hadn't seen him in years, that we had no relationship, no connection. He had come out of nowhere, dragging his violence and destruction into my life without warning. The witnesses backed me up. Neighbors who had called the police testified about what they saw through my windows, how they had found me bloodied and beaten on the floor. The officers who arrested Tom recounted how he resisted arrest, how he fought them even after the attack, still fueled by his drunken rage. The judge wasn't swayed by Tom's excuses. He saw through the lies, saw Tom for what he really was, a dangerous man who had let his anger and alcohol take complete control. Tom was convicted of assault and sentenced to prison. He wouldn't be hurting anyone else for a long time. After the trial, I tried to focus on getting better. The physical injuries, broken ribs, the concussion, and bruises, healed with time, but the mental scars were a different battle. For months, I struggled with nightmares and flashbacks, reliving the attack over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, like at any moment someone else could come crashing into my life, bringing chaos and violence all over again. But this time I wasn't alone. My new friends rallied around me, supporting me through the darkest days. They visited me in the hospital, brought me food, helped me with basic tasks I couldn't do on my own while I was recovering. For the first time in my life, I had people who genuinely cared about me. People without ulterior motives or hidden strings attached. I also made the decision to start seeing a therapist. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't think talking to someone would make a difference. I had spent so many years bottling up my trauma, carrying it silently, that it seemed impossible to unload it. But after a few sessions, I began to realize how much I had been carrying: years of trauma from my childhood, the abuse from my parents, and the sudden violent attack from Tom. All of it had been weighing me down, suffocating me from the inside. The therapy sessions helped me process everything. Piece by piece, I started to unpack the pain and fear I had buried deep inside. I confronted the memories of growing up in a toxic household, the lingering feeling of never being good enough, and the haunting image of Tom's fists crashing into me. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And for the first time, I began to feel like I was finally freeing myself. Not just from Tom, but from the years of hurt I had been running from for so long. Healing wasn't quick, and it wasn't linear. But with the support of my friends and the strength I found in myself, I kept moving forward.